The scent marker hit Cade Murren's throat like a fist. He stopped mid-stride on the game trail, one boot planted in the loose shale, the other hovering over a depression in the moss that he now recognized as a paw print. The print was the size of a dinner plate, 5 toes, deep claw furrows, and the musk coming off the scrape mark on the boulder beside it was so dense, so aggressively territorial, that his eyes watered. Behind him, the Sethani research escort, 4 soldiers in full environmental suits, visors polarized, pulse rifles at low ready fanned into a defensive arc without a word. Their squad leader, a tall reptilian officer named Thornback, raised one clawed hand in the halt signal and brought her scanner up with the other. "Territorial boundary," she said. "Recent. Less than 6 hours." Cade crouched beside the paw print and pressed 2 fingers into the compressed earth. Cool. Slightly damp. The ridges of the toe pads were still crisp, not eroded by wind or the thin mist that crept along the ridgeline every afternoon. He leaned closer and inhaled through his nose the way old-school trackers did, the way his grandfather had taught him in the hill country back on Earth, sorting the scent layers, soil minerals, crushed lichen, animal musk, and underneath it all, something warm and vaguely metallic that he'd never encountered in any xenobiology database. "Thornback," he said. "Adult female based on the stride length, probably 400 kilos. Thornback's neck frill flattened, the Sethani equivalent of a frown. Dr. Murren, the expedition charter limits us to the lowland survey zone. The ridgeline is outside our permitted boundary. The ridgeline is where they live. The ridgeline is where they kill." Cade stood up and looked at her. Thornback was a competent officer. She'd been assigned to his research team 6 weeks ago, when the Sethani Territorial Authority had grudgingly approved his permit to study the apex predators of Varath Core, the mountainous highland continent that the Sethani had declared a restricted zone 40 years ago after losing an entire military survey team to what they described in their official report as an unclassifiable pack-hunting species of extreme lethality. The Sethani had responded the way most species responded to something they couldn't kill. They drew a line on a map and pretended the problem didn't exist. For 4 decades, no one had crossed that line. The Thornbacks, his name for them, based on the prominent spinal ridge visible in the only surviving drone footage, had become a rumor. A cautionary tale Sethani parents told their children, the monsters in the mountains. Cade had spent 11 years trying to get a permit to study them. 11 years of grant applications, species classification appeals, and diplomatic arguments that basically amounted to, "The fact that they're dangerous is exactly why we need to understand them." The Sethani had refused every application. Then the Galactic Xenobiology Council had intervened, pointing out that a Class 9 apex predator couldn't remain unclassified indefinitely, and the Sethani had been forced to approve a limited study. Lowland observation only, military escort mandatory, no contact with live specimens. No contact, as if you could study an apex predator by standing on the other side of a valley with binoculars. "Thornback," Cade said, keeping his voice level, "the whole point of this expedition is to observe Thornback behavior in their natural range. Their natural range is the ridgeline. If we stay in the lowlands, all we'll find is old scat and shed fur." The charter is specific, Doctor. Charter was written by people who have never been closer to a Thornback than a committee room. He pulled his field notebook from his jacket pocket, actual paper, actual pencil, because electronic devices had a tendency to malfunction in the highlands, something about the mineral composition of the basalt, and showed her the sketch he'd made that morning. A topographic rendering of the western ridge, with every scent marker, scrape, and game trail he'd cataloged over the past 3 weeks marked in red. "Look at this. The territorial markers form a corridor, a specific path. They're not random, it's a patrol route. Something is maintaining a perimeter around the upper basin. That means there's something in the upper basin worth defending. Torves studied the sketch, her vertical pupils contracted. A denning site. That's my guess. Cubs, maybe. A breeding pair. Something that would make the risk of going up there worth the data we'd bring back. Or something that would make whatever is patrolling that perimeter very motivated to kill anything that approaches. Also possible. The four soldiers exchanged glances. Cade could read their body language even through the environmental suits. The slight shift of weight, the way their grip tightened on their rifles, the involuntary flare of neck frills that Sethani couldn't suppress when they were afraid. They were afraid. They had been afraid since the expedition had crossed the tree line 3 days ago and entered the sparse, wind-scoured alpine zone where the Thornback scent markers began appearing every 50 meters. Cade wasn't afraid. He'd been tracking apex predators across 8 different worlds for 23 years, starting with Terran wolves on the reintroduction preserves of northern Canada and working his way up through increasingly dangerous alien biomes. He'd been charged by a Drenari plane stalker on Kephai's IV and had talked it down by standing still and breathing slowly until the animal's threat display wound down. He'd spent 3 months in a ground blind on Osek watching a pack of armored river hunters raise their young, recording behavioral data that had eventually led to the species being reclassified from hostile to territorially defensive, a distinction that saved them from a planned military extermination. He wasn't naive about the danger. He'd seen what apex predators could do. He'd carried the body of a colleague off a mountainside on Vereth Minor after a territorial male had caught their survey team inside its hunting range. He understood that every predator species he studied was fully capable of killing him, and that the margin between a successful observation and a body bag was measured in the researcher's ability to read the animal's behavior and respond correctly. But he also understood something that most species didn't, that the vast majority of apex predator encounters ended without violence, not because predators were gentle, but because predators were efficient. Violence cost energy. Energy was survival. A 400-kilo Thornback didn't maintain its position at the top of Vereth Corps' food chain by fighting everything it encountered. It maintained it by making everything it encountered understand, through posture and scent and sound, that fighting would be a mistake. The violence was the backup plan. The first plan was always communication. "I'm going up," Cade said. Torves's frill went rigid. "Doctor, my orders are to ensure your safety." "Then come with me, or stay here and let me go alone." He shouldered his pack, adjusted the strap on his field recorder and started up the trail. "Either way, I'm going." He heard Torves hiss something in Sethani that her translator didn't render. Then he heard the crunch of boots on shale as the escort fell in behind him. The ridge trail climbed steeply for the first kilometer, switchbacking through loose rock and stunted alpine scrub. The air thinned. The wind picked up. The scent markers grew more frequent and more intense. Not just scrapes on boulders now, but claw gouges in the exposed rock face, urine marks on prominent outcrops, and once, a series of deep parallel furrows torn into the bark of a dead tree that stood alone on a promontory overlooking the valley. Cade measured the furrows. They were 2 centimeters deep and spaced 8 centimeters apart, consistent with the 5-toed forepaw of an animal weighing between 300 and 500 kilos. The tree had been dead for years. The claw marks were fresh. "She's been here recently," Cade said, more to himself than to the escort, "refreshing the marks, making sure the boundary is clear." "Making sure we know we're not welcome," Torves corrected. Same thing from her perspective. At the 2-kilometer mark, the trail leveled onto a broad shelf of exposed basalt that jutted from the mountainside like a balcony. The view was staggering. The entire Korathi Valley spread below them, a landscape of dark green jungle broken by silver rivers and the distant geometric scar of the Sethani lowland outpost where the expedition had based. Above them, the ridge continued upward for another 300 meters before cresting at the lip of the upper basin that satellite imagery showed as a roughly circular depression. An ancient volcanic crater, heavily forested, with a small lake at its center. Cade set his pack down on the basalt shelf and pulled out his observation scope. He scanned the upper slopes, working in a systematic grid pattern, looking for movement, color breaks, heat signatures against the cool rock. Nothing. The mountainside was empty and still. But it didn't feel empty. Something about the quality of the silence, the way the wind noise dropped in certain pockets, the absence of the small alpine birds that should have been calling from the scrub, told him that the mountain was occupied. Something was watching them, something that had made everything else go quiet. "Contact," one of the soldiers whispered. Cade lowered the scope and followed the soldier's pointing hand. 200 meters up the slope, on a flat outcrop of dark rock, a shape was standing. The Thornback was bigger than he'd expected. The drone footage from 40 years ago had shown a blurred silhouette, wolf-like in general shape but heavier, more muscular, with a prominent spinal ridge that ran from the base of the skull to the root of the tail. What the drone footage hadn't conveyed was the sheer physical presence of the animal. The Thornback stood on the outcrop like it had been carved from the mountain itself, 400 kilos of dense, charcoal-gray fur over heavy bone and layered muscle, with a head as broad as Cade's torso and a jaw that could have closed around his thigh. The spinal ridge was exactly what he predicted, a double row of keratinous plates, dark and glossy, that ran along the animal's back like armor. Its eyes were amber, large, forward-facing, predator's eyes, and they were fixed on Cade with an intensity that he felt in his sternum. It wasn't growling, it wasn't displaying, it was standing absolutely still, looking at him, and that stillness was more unsettling than any threat display he'd ever witnessed, because it meant the animal was thinking. It was assessing. It was deciding. Behind him, he heard the click of 4 pulse rifles being switched from safe to active. "No," Cade said without turning. "Weapons down." "Doctor." "Weapons down. Now she can see them. She knows what they are." A pause. Then Thorvald said something low and clipped, and the clicks came again, safe positions. But Cade could feel the tension radiating off the escort like heat from a furnace. Every Sethani instinct was screaming at them to fight or run, and the only thing holding them in place was military discipline, and the fact that their assignment was to keep this lunatic human alive. Cade set the scope down. He straightened. He made sure his hands were visible, empty, open, away from his body. "Hello," he said. The Thornback's ears, large, triangular, heavily furred, rotated toward his voice. Its nostrils flared. A low sound came from its chest, not a growl but something deeper, more resonant, a subsonic rumble that Cade felt in his bones. He'd heard something similar from Terran elephants, infrasound used for long-distance communication. The Thornback was talking, not to him, to something behind the ridgeline. The response came 30 seconds later. Another subsonic pulse, this one from higher up the mountain, fainter but distinct. Then another from the left. Then another from the right. The pulses overlapped, creating a complex harmonic pattern that vibrated through the basalt shelf beneath Cade's boots. The pack was communicating. The sentry had announced their presence, and the pack was answering. "Doctor," Thorvald said, her voice tight, "there are multiple contacts. The scanner is reading thermal signatures at 150 meters, 200 meters, and 300 meters. We are surrounded." "We've been surrounded since we crossed the boundary marker 2 kilometers ago," Cade said. "They've been pacing us the whole way up. The sentry is just the one they're letting us see." He kept his eyes on the Thornback. The animal hadn't moved. Its ears were still oriented toward him, and its nostrils were working, pulling in his scent, cataloging it, cross-referencing it against every other scent it had ever encountered. Cade knew what it was learning, that he was unfamiliar, that he was not Sethani, that he carried no chemical markers of aggression, that his heartbeat was elevated but not panicked, and that, crucially, he was not running. On every world Cade had ever worked, across every predator species he'd ever studied, the single most important behavioral signal was the same. The creature that doesn't run is either not prey or something worse than prey. Prey ran. Things that didn't run were either too large to eat, too dangerous to fight, or too strange to categorize. In all three cases, the correct predator response was caution, and caution looked exactly like what the Thornback was doing, standing still, watching and waiting to see what happened next. Cade took a step forward. Behind him, Torvis made a sound that was half word, half hiss. He ignored it. He took another step, then another. He moved slowly, deliberately, keeping his body angled slightly sideways, presenting a smaller profile, signaling that he wasn't squaring up for a confrontation. His hands stayed open and visible. His eyes stayed on the Thornback, but not locked on its eyes. He looked at the space between its eyes and the bridge of its nose, the way you looked at a wolf to show awareness without challenge. At 50 meters, the Thornback's spinal ridge lifted. The keratinous plates fanned slightly like a bird raising its hackles, a warning display, go no further. Cade stopped. He stood for a full minute, breathing, letting the animal see that he respected the signal. Then he did something that went against every piece of conventional xenobiology training he'd ever received. He crouched. Not a squat, a kneel. One knee on the cold basalt, the other leg folded beneath him, his hands resting on his thighs, head lowered. Not submission, not quite. Something closer to what old Earth naturalists called a greeting posture, a voluntary reduction of height and profile that communicated in the most ancient and universal body language available. I am not a threat. I am choosing to be small. The wind blew across the shelf. Mist curled around the Thornback's legs. The infrasonic communication continued, pulses from the ridgeline, from the flanks, the pack talking among themselves about this strange thing that had walked into their territory and then made itself small. Then the Thornback moved. It came down from the outcrop in 3 strides, each footfall placed with a precision that belied its mass. It crossed the intervening rock with a fluid, rolling gait that was wolf-like in its efficiency, but heavier, more deliberate, each step carrying the weight of an animal that had never needed to be fast because nothing on this mountain could outrun its endurance. It closed the distance to 30 meters, 20, 15. At 10 meters, Cade could smell it. The musk was overwhelming, not unpleasant, but dense, layered, carrying information he couldn't consciously decode, but that his hindbrain registered as large, old, and absolutely in control. The animal's fur was coarser than it looked, more like quills than hair, and the spinal ridge plates had a blue-black iridescence that caught the dim mountain light. Its breath came in slow, measured exhalations that he could feel on his face. At 5 meters it stopped. It lowered its massive head until its eyes were level with Cade's, amber and gold, with vertical pupils that contracted as they focused on his face. This close, he could see the scars, old ones, healed over, the marks of territorial disputes and hunting injuries accumulated over what he estimated was 15 to 20 years of life at the top of the food chain. This animal was not young. It was not a reckless juvenile testing its boundaries. It was a mature alpha, a creature that had survived everything this mountain had thrown at it, and it was looking at Cade the way Cade had seen alpha wolves look at other alphas across a territorial line, with respect, with caution, and with something that, if he'd been willing to anthropomorphize, he would have called curiosity. The Thornback inhaled. A deep pulling breath that drew in everything Cade was, his sweat, his skin oils, the residue of the ration bar he'd eaten that morning. The faint chemical traces of the decontamination wash the Sethani required before every field excursion, and underneath all of that, the fundamental biochemistry of a human being. A mammal, a warm blood, A fellow predator species from a world as violent and competitive as this one. It exhaled. The breath washed over Cade's face, warm and thick, and he held still, absolutely still. His heartbeat was loud in his own ears, and he knew the Thornback could hear it, could probably hear the blood moving through his carotid, could read his adrenaline levels from the chemistry of his sweat, but his body stayed quiet. His hands stayed on his thighs. His eyes stayed at the bridge of the animal's nose. The Thornback made a sound, not the infrasonic pulse, something higher, softer, a chuffing vocalization almost like a cough, that Cade's field recorder captured, and that he would later identify as a greeting call used between pack members who hadn't seen each other in several days. A sound of recognition. Not recognition of Cade specifically. It had never seen a human before, but recognition of what he was. What his body language said. What his refusal to run, his willingness to kneel, his calm heartbeat and open hands communicated in a language older than any spoken word. Fellow apex, not prey, not threat, something else. The Thornback pressed its forehead against Cade's chest. The weight of it nearly knocked him backward. 400 kilos of skull and neck, leaning into him with a slow, deliberate pressure that pushed the air from his lungs and made the muscles in his legs burn to keep him upright. But he held. He put one hand on the side of the animal's head, carefully, slowly, fingers spread wide on the coarse fur behind its ear, and he held. The mountain went still. Behind him, the escort wasn't breathing. Cade couldn't see them, but he could feel their silence. The absolute, shocked stillness of 4 armed soldiers watching the deadliest predator on the continent press its skull against a kneeling human's chest like a dog greeting its owner after a long day. The infrasonic pulses from the ridgeline had stopped. The entire pack had gone quiet. Every Thornback on the mountain was listening, watching, and what they saw was their alpha, the creature that nothing on this world could challenge, choosing to rest her head against the chest of a strange, small, bipedal animal that had walked into their territory alone and unarmed and knelt down. "Easy," Cade whispered. His hand moved gently along the fur behind the Thornback's ear. "Easy, girl, I'm just here to learn." The chuffing sound came again. Then the Thornback pulled back, raised her head and turned toward the upper ridge. She took 3 steps, stopped and looked back at him. He'd seen this behavior before. In wolves, in Drenari plain stalkers, in every pack hunting species he'd ever studied that had a social hierarchy built on earned respect rather than raw dominance. The backward glance was an invitation. "Follow." Cade stood up. His knee ached from the cold rock. He picked up his pack and slung it over his shoulder. "We're moving," he said. Dr. Torvis's voice was barely audible. "What just happened?" "She's decided we're not a threat. She wants to show us the basin." "How can you possibly know that?" Cade looked at her. The squad leader's frill was fully flared, her pupils dilated, her clawed hands gripping her rifle so tightly that the polymer stock was creaking. She was terrified. All 4 of them were terrified. They had just watched the nightmare of Sethani folklore walk up to a human and rest its head on his chest. And the only framework they had for understanding what they'd seen was the 40-year-old military report that described the Thornbacks as an unclassifiable pack hunting species of extreme lethality. "Because I've spent my whole life learning how to listen to animals," Cade said, "and right now she's saying follow me, so I'm going to follow her." He turned and walked up the trail. The Thornback waited until he was within 10 meters, then turned and continued climbing. Her gait was relaxed now, not the coiled alertness of a sentry on patrol, but the easy, rolling stride of an animal moving through its own territory with no concern for threats. She glanced back at him every 30 or 40 meters, checking that he was keeping up, adjusting her pace when the trail steepened, and he had to pick his way through loose rock. The escort followed. Cade could hear them behind him, the crunch of their boots, the faint whir of Torvis's scanner, the occasional whispered exchange in Sethani that the translators rendered as fragmented anxiety. They were following because their orders said to follow the human. Every other instinct they possessed said to run. Halfway up the next switchback, the trail narrowed to a ledge barely wide enough for 2 soldiers abreast. The Alpha navigated it without breaking stride, her massive body flowing along the rock face with a grace that made Cade's notebook hand itch. He was cataloging her gait mechanics in his head, the way her shoulder blades rotated independently, the way her rear paws landed precisely in the prints left by her front paws, a tracking behavior called direct register that wolves used on Earth to minimize noise and energy expenditure. She'd been doing it unconsciously, the way a human breathes. 1,000,000 years of evolution condensed into muscle memory. The soldier behind Cade, a young Sethani whose name tag read Keller, slipped on the loose shale. His boot kicked a fist-sized rock off the ledge, and it clattered down the mountainside with a sound that carried across the valley like a gunshot. The Alpha stopped, her spinal ridge lifted. Her head swung toward the sound, and for 3 heartbeats she was not the calm guide who had pressed her head against Cade's chest. She was 400 kilos of territorial predator assessing a potential threat, every plate on her back fanned wide, her lips pulled back just enough to show the curved upper canines, each one as long as Cade's index finger. Then she looked at Cade. He held her gaze, not challenging, just steady, present. "Easy," he said, the same word, the same tone. The ridge plates settled, the lips closed. The Alpha turned back to the trail and resumed walking. Behind Cade, Keller was shaking so badly his armor joints were clicking. "She gave us a warning," Cade said without turning around. "1 loose rock is forgivable. Keep your footing." They climbed in tighter formation after that. The trail switched back twice more, and at each turn Cade noticed fresh scent marks, not the old boundary markers from below, but active ones, laid down within hours. The pack was tracking their progress. He could feel it in the quality of the silence around them, in the way the alpine birds had gone quiet, in the absence of the small rodent analogues that should have been rustling through the scrub at this elevation. Everything on the mountain knew the Thornbacks were alert, and everything on the mountain had decided to be somewhere else. At one turn, Cade caught movement in his peripheral vision and stopped. 60 meters to the right, on a parallel ridge, a second Thornback stood watching them. This one was smaller than the Alpha, a subadult, maybe 18 months old, with the leggy, unfinished proportions of an adolescent still growing into its frame. Its spinal ridge was half-developed, the plates uneven and slightly crooked, and it was staring at Cade with an intensity that bordered on fixation. "Second contact," Torves murmured. "Thermal shows a third on the ridge above, and 2 more in the tree line at the base of the next switchback." "Flankers," Cade said. "The Alpha isn't leading us alone. The pack is escorting us in formation. She's the point. The others are wings and tail. That implies coordinated tactical movement. That implies they've done this before. Maybe not with visitors, but with threats, with other predators trying to enter the basin. They have a protocol." He pointed to the subadult on the parallel ridge. "That one's the spotter, young enough to be fast, old enough to raise the alarm. See how its ears are rotated, one toward us, one toward the basin. It's listening in both directions simultaneously." Torves stared at the subadult. "We assumed they were pack hunters, simple ambush predators. This is a society," Cade said. "A small one, a non-verbal one, but a society." The subadult held its position as they passed, its amber eyes tracking Cade's movement with the unblinking focus of a creature that was learning something new and intended to remember every detail. At the crest of the ridge, the upper basin opened before them. Cade stopped and stared. The basin was roughly circular, a kilometer across, walled by the broken rim of an ancient crater. Dense forest filled the interior, not the sparse alpine scrub of the outer slopes, but true old growth, with canopy trees 40 meters tall and an understory so thick it looked impenetrable. At the center, visible through a gap in the canopy, a small lake reflected the gray sky. Mist hung in the basin like smoke, curling between the trunks, and the air was warmer here, protected from the wind by the crater walls, fed by geothermal vents that Cade could smell in the faint sulfur tang underlying the forest scent. But the forest wasn't what made him stare. The thornbacks were everywhere. They lay in the open ground between the tree line and the crater rim, a dozen of them in loose clusters of 2 and 3. Some were sleeping, some were grooming. 2 juveniles half the size of the alpha, their spinal ridges still soft and flexible, were wrestling in a clearing, rolling over each other with a controlled aggression that was clearly play. An older animal, heavier than the alpha and missing most of its left ear, lay on a flat rock at the edge of the tree line, watching the juveniles with the resigned patience of a grandparent. And cubs. Cade counted 7, then 9, then realized there were more half-hidden in the undergrowth, small, round-bodied, their fur still the mottled brown and gray of juvenile camouflage. They tumbled and pounced and chased each other through the ferns, making high-pitched yipping sounds that carried across the basin like birdsong. It was a denning colony. The entire pack, concentrated in one protected location for the breeding season. The upper basin was their nursery, their home, the place they defended with the territorial perimeter that had kept the Sethani out for 40 years. And the alpha had just walked him to the front door. "Are you recording this?" Cade asked, not taking his eyes off the basin. "Every frequency," Torves whispered. Her terror had shifted into something else, not gone, but layered now with the same thing Cade was feeling. Awe. The raw, involuntary awe that came from seeing something no one had seen before, and realizing that the universe was bigger and stranger, and more complex than any committee report had ever suggested. The alpha descended into the basin. She walked through the clearing where the adults were resting, and as she passed, each one lifted its head, registered her presence, and then looked past her to the ridgeline where Cade stood. One by one, their amber eyes found him. One by one, they held his gaze. Not one of them stood up, not one of them growled, not one of them displayed. They watched, they assessed, and then they went back to what they were doing because their alpha had brought this creature here, and the alpha's judgment was the pack's law. Cade walked down into the basin. His boots crunched on the volcanic gravel of the slope, and the sound was loud in the quiet that had settled over the colony. He kept his pace steady, his posture open, his hands visible. The escorts followed 10 meters behind, moving in a tight cluster, their rifles pointed at the ground. Torves had stopped whispering. The scanner was recording, but she wasn't looking at it. She was looking at the thornbacks the way you look at something that has just dismantled every assumption you've held since childhood. The first cub reached Cade at the bottom of the slope. It came barreling out of the ferns at full speed, skidded on the gravel, and slammed into his left boot with enough force to stagger him. It was the size of a large house cat, its spinal ridge still flat against its back, its fur sticking up in every direction, and it looked up at him with enormous amber eyes that held nothing but curiosity. It sniffed his boot. It sneezed. Then it grabbed the lace of his boot in its teeth and began pulling. Cade laughed. He couldn't help it. The sound came out before he could stop it. A genuine, unguarded laugh that echoed across the basin and made every adult thornback in earshot lift its head. "Hey," he said. He crouched down slowly and held out his hand. The cub released his bootlace, sniffed his fingers, sneezed again, and then pressed its small, warm head into his palm with a force that was wildly disproportionate to its size. Its fur was softer than the adult's, more like actual hair than quills, and underneath it, he could feel the rapid drumming of a tiny heart going at twice the rate of a human's. A second cub appeared, then a third. They came out of the undergrowth like they'd been waiting for permission, and within 30 seconds Cade had 5 cubs clustered around his boots, climbing over each other to sniff his hands, his pack, his jacket, his beard. One of them found the zipper on his field vest and began working it with its teeth, clearly fascinated by the mechanism. Another climbed onto his pack and sat there, its small weight pressing against his shoulder blades. He stayed crouched, his hands moving slowly between them, touching each one the side of a head, the ridge of a small back, the soft pads of a forepaw that would someday be large enough to leave dinner plate prints in the mountain stone. They chuffed. The adults chuffed back. The infrasonic pulses resumed, softer now, a low harmonic that resonated in Cade's chest like a second heartbeat. "They're not afraid of him," Torves said. She was standing 5 meters behind Cade, her rifle hanging forgotten at her side, her frill doing something he'd never seen before, not flared in fear, not flat in hostility, but rippled, cycling through positions that he suspected represented an emotion the Sethani didn't have a military protocol for. "They've never seen a human," Cade said, gently detaching a cub that was trying to chew through his pack strap. "They don't have a category for us, so they're making one right now. And the adults are allowing this. The alpha brought me here. In pack hierarchy, that's an endorsement. The cubs are following her lead." "She brought you here," Torves repeated, as if saying it again might make it more rational. "The apex predator of Verath Kor, the creature that killed 17 Sethani soldiers. She brought a human to her den." Cade didn't answer immediately. He was watching the alpha, who had settled onto a flat rock 30 meters away, her massive body curled into a resting position, her head raised just enough to keep him in view. She was calm, utterly calm. The coiled alertness of the sentry was gone, replaced by the deep, settled stillness of an animal in its own home, surrounded by its own pack, confident that nothing in its territory could challenge it. But her eyes never left him, not in suspicion, in something else. "She didn't bring me here to show me the den," Cade said quietly. "She brought me here to see what I'd do." "Meaning?" "Meaning every other species that's ever entered their territory came with weapons and fear. The Sethani survey team 40 years ago, they came armored, they came shooting. The Thornbacks killed them because that's what you do when something dangerous enters your home. But I came with empty hands and a slow heartbeat, and instead of running when she approached, I knelt down. That told her something. Something she needed to verify." "Verify how?" The cub on his pack shifted, dug its claws into the canvas, and let out a high-pitched yip directly into Cade's ear. He winced and reached back to scratch the small chin, which produced a buzzing purr he could feel through the canvas. "By showing me the most vulnerable thing she has," Cade said. "Her cubs. If I'd reacted with aggression, if I'd shouted or grabbed or moved too fast, the pack would know I'm a threat and we'd be dead already. But I did what I've always done. I sat down, I made myself small, and I let them come to me. And now she knows." "Knows what?" He looked at Torves. "That I'm the same kind of thing she is, something that protects the small ones." The afternoon began with a test Cade almost failed. He was settling into an observation position on a flat rock near the tree line when a nursing mother emerged from the undergrowth 10 meters to his left. She was smaller than the alpha but thicker through the chest, and 2 cubs were tucked against her belly, still nursing. The moment she saw Cade, her spinal ridge slammed upright and a snarl ripped out of her throat, a sound that hit Cade's chest like a physical blow, wet and resonant, and loaded with every frequency that evolution had designed to say you are about to die. The escort's rifles swung up. Torves barked hold to her soldiers or to Cade, he wasn't sure. Cade didn't move, he didn't breathe. He sat on the rock with his hands on his thighs and let the mother snarl, because he knew, the way he knew his own heartbeat, that what she was doing was not an attack. It was a question. The same question every mother on every world asks when something unfamiliar appears near her young. Are you dangerous? The answer was in the response. Run and you're prey, fight and you're a threat, sit still and you're furniture. Cade was furniture. The snarl wound down. The mother's ridge lowered by half. She took a step forward, head low, nostrils working. Another step. She was close enough now that Cade could have reached out and touched her muzzle, and her breath was hot against his wrist, and her eyes were locked on his with an intensity that made every nerve in his body want to flinch. He didn't flinch. The alpha from her rock 30 meters away made a single low chuff, one sound, short and decisive. The nursing mother's ridge went flat. She sniffed Cade's wrist once more, a final check, then turned and walked back to her cubs. She lay down, pulled them against her belly, and resumed nursing as if nothing had happened. Cade exhaled. His hands were steady, his shirt was soaked through. That, Torvis said very quietly, should have killed you. No, that should have killed someone who panicked. There's a difference. He picked up his field recorder, checked the audio levels, and went back to work. The rest of the afternoon passed in a way that Cade would struggle to describe in any scientific report. He sat in the basin among the Thornbacks, recording everything, vocalizations, social interactions, feeding behaviors, play patterns, hierarchical displays, infrasonic communication sequences, and the pack tolerated him the way they tolerated the weather. As a fact of the landscape, unremarkable, simply present. The cubs were relentless. They investigated everything. 2 of them dismantled his field notebook, scattering pages across the gravel until he retrieved them and zipped the notebook inside his vest. One of them stole his pencil and ran 20 meters before dropping it, then sat on it and dared him with its eyes to come get it. He went and got it, and the cub followed him back and sat on his boot. He ate a ration bar mid-afternoon, and that triggered an event that he would replay in lecture halls for the rest of his career. The crinkle of the wrapper brought 3 cubs running. They sniffed the bar, recoiled at the synthetic sweetener, fair enough. It tasted terrible to Cade too, and then one of them bolted into the tree line. 30 seconds later it came back dragging something. A chunk of freshly killed ground stalker, still warm, the hide torn open to expose the muscle beneath. The cub dropped it at Cade's feet and sat back, tongue out, tail sweeping the gravel. A food offering. A sharing behavior documented in wolves, in African wild dogs, in every pack hunting species on Earth. The instinct to feed a pack member who appeared to be eating poorly. The cub had seen Cade's ration bar, assessed it as inadequate, and fetched something better. Cade looked at the raw meat. He looked at the cub. He tore a small strip from the offering, put it in his mouth, chewed it slowly. It tasted like iron and copper and something vaguely floral, and swallowed. The cub's tail swept faster. 2 more cubs brought their own pieces, smaller ones, dropped with the same expectant posture. Behind him, he heard Keller gag softly. Torvis made a strangled sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. Cade ate what they brought, every piece. Because in the language of the pack, refusing a food offering was refusing the bond, and the bond was the whole point. The adults were more reserved, but no less attentive. A subadult female, maybe 2 years old, based on the development of her spinal ridge, approached him cautiously, sniffed his hand, and then lay down 3 meters away with her chin on her forepaws, watching him with the steady patience of an animal that had all the time in the world. An older male, the one missing part of his ear, walked past within arm's reach and paused to look at him sideways, one amber eye assessing, before continuing to the lake's edge to drink. The old male was the one who changed things. Cade had been sitting still for close to an hour, letting the cubs climb on and off his lap, when the old male returned from the lake and walked directly to him. Not past him, to him. It stopped less than a meter away, and lowered its massive head, until its scarred muzzle was level with Cade's face. The infrasonic rumble that came from its chest was different from the alpha's, deeper, rougher, with a harmonic undertone that Cade's field recorder later analyzed as a pattern used exclusively between senior pack members. A greeting between equals. The old male pressed its forehead against Cade's shoulder. Then it lay down beside him, its flank against his hip, its head resting on its forepaws, and closed its eyes. 450 kilos of apex predator, choosing to sleep against a human side. Cade put his hand on the old male's shoulder. The fur was coarser than the alpha's, brittled with age, and underneath it the body was warmer than a human, warmer than any canid he'd ever touched. The heartbeat was slow and strong, maybe 30 beats per minute, the resting pulse of something so large and so confident in its safety that its metabolism ran at idle even in the presence of a stranger. Dr. Murrin, Torvis's voice was barely a whisper. She was standing at the edge of the clearing, her squad arrayed behind her, all 4 of them still as statues. Her scanner was trembling in her hand. The old one, he is Varath Sar. What? The Sethani name, Varath Sar, the Mountain King, the one from the survey report, the one that led the attack on our soldiers 40 years ago. The scar on his left ear, it matches the description in the report. He was young then, a juvenile he would be. She paused, calculating. He would be the oldest living Thornback. Cade looked at the animal sleeping against his side. 40 years ago, this creature had killed Sethani soldiers who had entered its territory with weapons and hostility. Now it was resting against a human who had entered the same territory with empty hands and curiosity, and it was sleeping. Not because Cade had tamed it, not because he'd fed it or drugged it or broken its will. Because he had knelt down and held still, and the old male had decided, across every year of violence and solitude and territorial defense, that this small, warm-blooded creature was something it didn't need to fight. The moment held. Then the alpha rose from her rock, walked to where Cade sat, and lay down on his other side. He was bracketed by 2 of the largest predators on the planet, their combined weight pressing against him from both sides, their breathing synchronized into a slow rhythm that his own breathing gradually matched. The cubs piled into the gap between the alpha's forepaws and Cade's legs, a warm, wriggling knot of fur and small teeth, and yipping sounds that slowly quieted as the afternoon light softened, and the basin settled into the golden stillness of late day. Torvis sat down. She didn't decide to sit, her legs simply stopped holding her, and she folded onto the gravel with the scanner in her lap and her hands flat on her thighs and her frill finally still. Behind her, one by one, the soldiers followed. They set their rifles on the ground. They sat. They watched a human sit on a mountainside with the nightmares of Sethani legend sleeping against his body, cubs in his lap, and an expression on his face that Torvis would later describe in her report as the most inappropriate calm she had ever witnessed in any species. The sun was below the crater rim when the Thornback Alpha lifted her head and made a sound that Cade hadn't heard before, a long, modulating howl that started in the infrasonic range and climbed into audible frequencies, a sound so complex and layered that it seemed to carry meaning he couldn't parse. The old male lifted his head and joined, adding a deeper harmonic. Then the subadults, then the juveniles. One by one, every Thornback in the basin raised its voice, and the sound filled the crater and spilled over the rim and rolled down the mountainside like something alive. The cubs in Cade's lap tilted their heads back and tried to join. Their voices were thin and reedy, the high notes breaking and reforming, and the sound they made was the least threatening thing he had ever heard from an apex predator. It was the sound of small things learning to be large, of cubs rehearsing the call that would someday shake the mountain. Cade sat in the middle of it and listened, and what he heard was not a hunting call, not a territorial display, not a warning or a challenge. It was a gathering call, a roll call. The pack counting itself, confirming that everyone was present, that the day had passed safely, that the cubs were fed and the old ones were resting and the perimeter was holding, and the world outside the basin could do what it wanted because in here, in this place, the pack was whole. He closed his eyes. The sound resonated in his chest, in his bones, in the small, fragile chambers of his heart, and for a moment he was not a researcher or a scientist or a human on an alien world. He was just another warm body in the pack, counted and present and accounted for. When the call ended, the silence was absolute. Not the tense silence of earlier, the living silence of a place that is full, not empty. Cade opened his eyes and found the Alpha watching him. Her amber gaze was steady and warm and very old, and in it he saw something he'd spent 23 years looking for across 8 worlds. The recognition that the boundary between species was not a wall but a frequency, and that if you got quiet enough, patient enough, small enough, you could tune in to something on the other side of it that had been there all along. "Okay," he said softly. He put one hand on the Alpha's neck, feeling the slow pulse, the warmth, the living weight of a creature the Sethani had called a monster. "Okay, I hear you." The Alpha chuffed. She rested her chin on his knee and closed her eyes. Cade looked at Torves. The squad leader was sitting in the dirt with tears tracking down her scaled face, her scanner abandoned, her hands pressed flat against the ground, as if she was trying to feel the infrasonic vibrations that were still resonating in the rock beneath them. "This changes everything," she said. Cade nodded. He looked at the basin, the sleeping pack, the playing cubs, the old male breathing slowly against his side, the mist curling through the ancient trees. The world the Sethani had feared for 4 decades, that they'd walled off and refused to see, not because it was dangerous, because they'd never tried to understand it. "Yeah," he said, "it does." Night came to the basin the way it came to high places, fast, cold, and total. The crater rim blocked the last of the twilight, and within 20 minutes the basin was dark. Not the electric humming dark of a research station or the filtered dark of a ship's night cycle, but the absolute, star-punched dark of a place that had never known artificial light. Cade had expected the pack to disperse into the tree line for shelter. Instead, they gathered. The adults moved first, converging on the clearing where Cade sat with a deliberate, unhurried coordination that reminded him of elephants forming a defensive ring. The Alpha repositioned to his right. The old male stayed on his left. The nursing mother, the one who had snarled at him hours ago, settled directly behind him, close enough that Cade could feel the warmth of her body through his jacket. The subadults filled the gaps, and the cubs crawled into the center, finding spots between adult bodies and Cade's legs with the unerring instinct of creatures that had been sleeping in pile formation since birth. Within 10 minutes, Cade was embedded in a living structure of fur and bone and slow-breathing warmth. The combined body heat of 12 adult Thornbacks and 9 cubs raised the temperature in the clearing by what felt like 15 degrees. The cold mountain air above them might as well have been on another planet. Torves and the escort had withdrawn to the edge of the clearing. They sat in a tight cluster, their environmental suits heating elements activated, watching the pile with expressions that ranged from Keller's open-mouthed disbelief to Torves's quiet, measuring intensity. "Doctor," she called softly, "do you need extraction?" Cade almost laughed. He was lying on volcanic gravel with a 400-kilo predator pressed against each side, a nursing mother at his back, and 7 cubs draped across his legs and chest, one of them snoring directly into his ear with a buzzing rattle that vibrated his entire skull. His spine was going to hate him in the morning. His field jacket smelled like it would never be clean again. He had never been more comfortable in his life. "I'm fine," he said. "Get some sleep." He didn't sleep, not at first. He lay in the dark and listened. The pack breathed around him in overlapping rhythms, deep, slow, the exhalations of large bodies at rest. Occasionally an adult would shift, adjusting position, and the whole pile would ripple and resettle like water finding its level. A cub would whimper in its sleep, and the nearest adult would make a low, subsonic murmur, a sound below the threshold of conscious hearing, but one that Cade felt in his ribs. A comfort sound. A sound that said, "I'm here, you're safe, go back to sleep." Above them, the stars of an alien sky burned in configurations he'd never learned to name. The crater rim was a black edge against the stellar field, sharp and clean. Something moved on the rim, a shape, darker than the sky, crossing the southern notch with the careful, sliding gait of a large predator. Not a thornback. The silhouette was wrong, lower, wider, with a flat head and a tail that dragged. One of the basin's neighbor species, drawn by the scent of the colony, testing the perimeter. The alpha's eyes opened. Amber in the starlight, catching the faint glow, they tracked the shape on the rim with the focused attention of a creature that was never fully asleep. The old male's eye opened too, just the one, the side facing upward. His ear, the good one, rotated toward the rim. The shape on the rim paused. It had caught their scent, or more likely, had caught the absence of scent that meant the territorial markers were fresh, and the pack was present and alert. The alpha didn't growl. She didn't stand. She made a single infrasonic pulse, one note deep and steady, that Cade felt travel through the ground beneath him like a slow-motion earthquake. The old male answered with the same note, slightly offset, creating a harmonic interference pattern that Cade's field recorder would later show covered the entire basin in overlapping sound waves. The shape on the rim turned and left. No confrontation, no chase. Just the pulse. We are here. We are many. We are awake. And the intruder's calculation that whatever prey might be found in the basin was not worth the cost of fighting 20 thornbacks for it. The alpha's eyes closed. The old male's ear relaxed. Cade lay in the dark among the pack, his hand resting on the nearest cub's back, feeling its small heartbeat against his palm, and understood something that no database entry or threat classification could capture, that the thornback's lethality was not separate from their gentleness. It was the same thing, the same instinct that made the alpha press her skull against his chest in greeting, made her send a subsonic warning to a predator on the rim. The same impulse that made the cubs bring him food made the adults form a defensive ring around the den site at nightfall. Protection and affection were not different behaviors. They were the same behavior, expressed at different intensities, and the only variable was the context. The pack was not violent and also gentle. The pack was devoted, and devotion in a species built for war looked like both things at once. Cade slept. He dreamed of wolves. He woke to weak gray light and a cub sitting on his chest, staring at his face from a distance of 3 centimeters. Its breath smelled like raw meat and something floral, the same scent he'd noticed in the food offering. Its amber eyes were huge and unblinking. It chuffed, a tiny version of the adult greeting sound, and batted his nose with one soft paw. "Morning," Cade said. The cub sneezed on him and scrambled off his chest to rejoin the pack, which was already stirring. Adults stretched, yawned, revealing jaw architecture that could have crushed hull plating, and moved to the tree line. 2 subadults left the clearing at a ground-eating trot, headed for the perimeter. The sentry rotation. Cade noted it in his notebook. Dawn patrol, 2 subadults, clockwise circuit. Pack security was not random. It was a system, maintained by specific individuals on a consistent schedule. More evidence that this was not a loose aggregation of animals sharing a range. This was a community. The alpha rose from beside him, shook off the night's dew, and made a sound he hadn't heard before, a short, rising bark, 2 syllables directed at the trail leading down to the rim. She looked at Cade. He understood. Time to go. The alpha walked them down the mountain. She led the way along the ridge trail, pausing at the switchbacks to wait for the soldiers who were struggling with the steep terrain, and the cubs followed 9 of them in a loose, tumbling procession that kept pace with Cade's boots and investigated every rock, every scrub bush, every interesting smell along the way. The old male walked at the rear, his massive body unhurried, his one good ear rotating to track the sounds of the mountain behind them. At the territorial boundary, the boulder with the fresh scent mark where Cade had first stopped, a lifetime ago yesterday, the alpha stopped. She turned and faced Cade, and her posture was the same as when he'd first seen her on the outcrop above, alert, still, watching. Cade knelt, one knee on the shale, hands on his thighs, head lowered, the same posture, the same signal, the same language spoken without words. I am not a threat, I am choosing to be small, and I will come back. The Alpha pressed her forehead against his chest, lighter this time. A brief, firm contact, then she pulled away and stepped back. The cubs milled around his boots, yipping, reluctant to let this interesting creature leave. One of them grabbed his bootlace again and held on until Cade gently freed it. "I'll be back," he told them. "I promise." The Alpha turned and walked up the trail. The cubs followed. The old male paused beside Cade, looked at him with one amber eye, and made the chuffing greeting sound, the one between equals, before turning and following the pack up the mountain. Cade watched them go until the last cub disappeared over the ridgeline, and the mountain was still again. He stood up. His knee cracked. His back ached from sleeping on volcanic gravel. He had 3 notebooks full of data that would take months to analyze, 7 hours of audio recordings that contained vocalization patterns no xenobiologist had ever heard, and a field report that would force the Galactic Xenobiology Council to reclassify an entire species. And he had a promise to keep. He shouldered his pack, turned to the escort, and found Torves standing with her rifle slung across her back and her clawed hand extended toward him, palm up. The Sethani gesture of formal respect, offered between equals, never from officer to civilian. "The report I will file," she said, "will recommend the permanent expansion of this study, full access to the upper basin, no weapons, and I will request assignment as your permanent escort." Cade looked at her hand. He took it. "You're not afraid anymore," he said. Torves's frill rippled the same unclassifiable pattern he'd seen in the basin, the emotion her species didn't have a protocol for. "I am terrified, Doctor, but I am also," she paused, searching for the word, "corrected. I have spent my career defending my people against threats. I have never considered that some of the threats were simply things we failed to understand." Cade squeezed her hand. "That's the job. Understanding monsters. Understanding that they're not monsters." He released her hand and looked up the mountain one more time. The ridge was empty. The wind carried nothing but the clean, cold scent of high altitude and ancient stone. But somewhere beyond the ridgeline, in a basin that smelled of forest and warm fur and the sulfur tang of volcanic earth, a pack was settling in for the day. Cubs were playing. The old male was sleeping in the sun. And an alpha was watching the trail, amber eyes steady, waiting with the patience of something that had learned in a single afternoon that not everything that walked upright was an enemy. Some of them knelt. "Let's go," Cade said. "We have a report to write that's going to make a lot of committee members very uncomfortable." He started down the mountain. Behind him the escort followed, and above them, barely audible, carried on the wind from the far side of the ridge, a single infrasonic pulse rolled down the mountainside, a sound too deep for Sethani ears, but one that Cade felt in his sternum and recognized for what it was. The pack counting its members. One more than yesterday. The lowland outpost was exactly as they'd left it, prefab walls, humming generators, the sterile geometry of a Sethani field station surrounded by jungle that wanted to eat it. Cade walked through the decontamination arch on autopilot, stood still while the UV sweep ran over his clothing, and then sat down on a supply crate in the staging area and stared at nothing for a long time. His field recorder held 7 hours of audio. His notebooks held 3 days of behavioral observations that would take a year to properly analyze. His clothing smelled like Thornback musk, volcanic sulfur, and the sharp metallic tang of raw meat he'd eaten from a cub's mouth. He should have been writing. He should have been organizing data, labeling audio files, starting the preliminary species behavior report that the Galactic Xenobiology Council was waiting for. Instead, he sat on the crate and listened to the jungle sounds outside the station walls and thought about how different they were from the sounds of the basin. Down here, everything competed, birds shrieking over territory, insects grinding their legs together in mating calls, something large crashing through the undergrowth 100 meters out. Up there, when the pack was settled, everything went quiet. Not the silence of absence, the silence of presence. The silence of a place that had a ruler, and the ruler was awake. Torves found him 2 hours later. She'd filed her preliminary report. He could tell because her frill was doing the rapid cycling pattern that Sethani exhibited after sustained cognitive effort. She sat on the crate next to him, set her scanner on the ground between her feet, and stared at the same wall he was staring at. "The territorial authority has requested a full debrief," she said. "They want to know why we violated the charter boundary." "What did you tell them?" "I told them the boundary was scientifically irrelevant, and that Dr. Murren had made contact with the species in a manner that demonstrated the existing threat classification was fundamentally inaccurate." She paused. "I also told them the Alpha let him touch her." Cade looked at her. "How did they respond?" "The senior director asked me to repeat that statement 3 times. Then he asked if I was experiencing altitude-induced cognitive impairment." Cade laughed a short, tired sound. "Can't blame him." "I can. I spent 40 minutes explaining what I saw, and at the end of it the director's primary concern was whether your contact with the Alpha constituted a provocation event that might trigger retaliatory aggression against Sethani settlements." Torves's frill went flat. 40 years of fear. That's what we're dealing with. Not ignorance, fear. They know the Thornbacks aren't mindless. They know a mindless animal couldn't have executed the coordinated defense that killed their survey team. They're afraid because the Thornbacks are intelligent, and intelligent predators are harder to dismiss. Cade nodded. He'd dealt with the same institutional inertia on every world he'd worked. The pattern was always the same. A species was classified as hostile. The classification became policy, the policy became doctrine, and the doctrine became identity. Once a culture had organized itself around fear of something, removing that fear threatened the culture itself. The Sethani had built 40 years of territorial policy, military procurement, and public narrative around the idea that the Thornbacks were monsters. Telling them the monsters were a family was telling them their entire framework was wrong. "The data will speak for itself," Cade said. "The audio recordings alone, the infrasonic communication patterns, the greeting vocalizations, the comfort sounds used with cubs, that's enough to force a reclassification review. Add the behavioral observations, the coordinated sentry rotations, the food sharing, the communal sleeping formation, the territorial defense through communication rather than violence, and you've got a species that meets at least 6 of the 12 criteria for sapient-adjacent classification." "Sapient-adjacent," Torves repeated. "That would place them under the Galactic Sentient Species Protection Act, which would make the restricted zone permanent, but as a protected habitat, not a quarantine. No military operations, no development, no resource extraction. The upper basin would become a preserve. The territorial authority will resist." "The territorial authority doesn't get a vote. The GXBC has jurisdiction over species classification, and the Protection Act is galactic law." Cade rubbed his face. His beard was full of dried thornback saliva and something that might have been cub snot. "I need a shower." "You need to write the report first, while the details are fresh." She was right. She was always right about the procedural things. Cade pulled his field notebook from his vest. The pages were crumpled where a cub had chewed the corner, and opened it to the first blank page. He wrote for 6 hours. Not the formal report that would come later, with proper data analysis and peer-reviewed formatting, and the careful hedged language that scientific publications demanded. This was the raw account. What he'd seen. What he'd felt. What the Alpha's eyes looked like at 5 meters, amber and gold, and ancient, and alive with an intelligence that no scanner could measure because scanners measured frequency and amplitude, not meaning. He wrote about the cubs. The way they dismantled his notebook with the focused curiosity of toddlers investigating a new toy. The way the smallest one had brought him food, dragging a piece of fresh kill across the gravel with the determined, wobbling effort of a creature half its mother's size trying to do a grown-up thing. The buzzing purr that came from their chests when he scratched under their chins. The way they'd piled into the sleeping formation at nightfall, tiny bodies pressing into every available gap between the adults, seeking warmth and contact, and the slow breathing of the pack around them. He wrote about the old male, Varathsar, the Mountain King, the creature that had killed Sethani soldiers 40 years ago and now slept against a human side with its scarred head on its forepaws and its one good ear twitching at sounds too faint for Cade to hear. The greeting rumble it had given him, the harmonic pattern used between senior pack members, the weight of its body against his hip, warm and vast and utterly relaxed. He wrote about the moment the alpha pressed her forehead against his chest, and about the second time she did it at the boundary marker when he left. He wrote about the difference between the two, the first time exploratory, testing, the animal deciding what he was, the second time brief and deliberate, the animal confirming what it had already decided. And he wrote about the howl, the gathering call at sunset when every thornback in the basin had raised its voice, and the sound had filled the crater and spilled over the rim and rolled down the mountainside, and the cubs had tilted their heads back and tried to join with their thin, breaking voices. He wrote that it was a roll call, a counting, a confirmation that the pack was whole. And he wrote that when the call had ended and the silence had settled, he'd understood something that no database or committee report or threat classification could capture. That the line between predator and protector was not a line at all. It was a choice, made fresh every day in every interaction by creatures intelligent enough to know the difference. The report went to the Galactic Xenobiology Council the following week. Torves's military report went to the Sethani Territorial Authority the same day. Within 72 hours, Cade's communication terminal was buried under 319 messages, from xenobiologists requesting data access, from journalists requesting interviews, from Sethani politicians requesting clarification, and from the GXBC requesting an emergency classification review hearing. The hearing took place 6 weeks later, on the Sethani Capitol Station, in a chamber designed for exactly the kind of bureaucratic spectacle that Cade had spent his career trying to avoid. He presented his data. He played the audio recordings. He showed the behavioral analysis. He explained in the careful, measured language that institutional audiences required that the Thornbacks of Varath Core were not a hostile species. They were a highly intelligent, socially complex, family-structured apex predator with demonstrated capacity for interspecies communication, threat assessment, and the word that made half the committee shift in their seats, trust. The Sethani delegate objected. The Thornbacks had killed 17 soldiers. They were demonstrably lethal. They could not be reclassified based on one researcher's experience. Cade agreed. They were demonstrably lethal. So were humans. The question was not whether a species could kill, every predator could kill. The question was whether a species chose when to kill and why, and under what circumstances it chose not to. The Thornbacks had chosen not to kill Cade. They had chosen not to kill his escort. They had, in fact, chosen to feed him, shelter him, and include him in their communal sleeping formation. The 17 soldiers who died 40 years ago had entered Thornback territory armed, armored, and broadcasting every chemical and behavioral signal that evolution had designed to communicate hostile intent. The Thornbacks had responded the way any intelligent territorial species would respond to an armed incursion into their nursery. The word nursery landed in the committee room like a stone in still water. Cade watched the ripples move through the delegates, the slight shifts in posture, the exchanged glances, the recalculation happening behind their eyes as they processed the idea that the military survey team hadn't been ambushed by monsters. They'd walked into a nursery. The vote took 3 more weeks of deliberation, but the outcome was never really in doubt. The data was too clear. The audio recordings were too compelling. And Torves's testimony, the squad leader who had spent her career defending her people against threats, sitting in front of the committee and describing, in precise military language, the moment a Thornback Alpha pressed its forehead against a kneeling human's chest, was impossible to dismiss. The Thornbacks of Varath Core were reclassified as a sapient-adjacent species under galactic protection. The restricted zone became a permanent preserve. Military operations were prohibited. Development was prohibited. The only permitted access was scientific research, conducted under strict behavioral protocols that Cade spent the next 4 months writing. He went back to the basin 11 times in the first year. Every time the Alpha met him at the boundary marker. Every time he knelt, and she pressed her forehead against his chest. Every time the cubs came tumbling out of the undergrowth to investigate his boots and steal his pencils and bring him offerings of fresh kill that he ate without complaint. The old male always walked to him within the first hour, pressed his scarred head against Cade's shoulder, and lay down at his side. On his 7th visit, one of the cubs he'd met that first day, the one that had sat on his boot and chewed his pack strap, was twice its original size and developing the first hint of spinal ridge plates. It still sat on his boot. It no longer fit. On his 9th visit, the nursing mother who had snarled at him walked to where he sat, looked at him for a long moment, and then lay down with her chin on his knee. The same knee the Alpha rested her chin on. The same gesture. The pack's language for you are one of us. On his 11th visit, the Alpha brought him somewhere new. She led him past the basin, through the old-growth forest, along a game trail he hadn't seen before, to a shallow cave at the base of the inner crater wall. The cave was warm, geothermal vents ran beneath the rock floor, and the walls were smooth, worn by generations of large bodies passing through the entrance. Inside, on a shelf of flat basalt, were bones. Not prey bones, Thornback bones. Skulls, ribcage, the heavy plates of spinal ridges arranged with a care that was unmistakable. Not scattered by scavengers. Placed. Positioned. The skulls faced the cave entrance, oriented toward the basin, toward home. A burial site. Or something close to it. A place where the dead were brought and laid to rest by the living, where the bones were kept and maintained and visited. Cade stood in the cave entrance and looked at the remains of Thornbacks who had lived and hunted and protected this basin long before any Sethani had drawn a line on a map, and he understood why the Alpha had brought him here. She was showing him everything, the living and the dead, the cubs and the ancestors, the whole of it, because that was what you did when someone was pack. You held nothing back. Cade knelt in the cave entrance. The Alpha stood beside him, her flank against his shoulder, her breath slow and warm. Outside, the basin spread below them, the lake, the forest, the clearing where the cubs were playing, the flat rock where the old male lay in the afternoon sun. The light was golden, and the air smelled like warm fur and volcanic earth, and the clean, sharp scent of high altitude. He put his hand on the Alpha's neck. Her pulse was slow and steady under his palm. "I hear you," he said, the same words, the same tone, the only language that had ever mattered between them. The Alpha chuffed once and rested her head against his shoulder. Above them, on the crater rim, a subadult stood sentry, its ears rotating, its amber eyes scanning the approaches. The perimeter was holding. The pack was whole. And the man who had walked into their territory with empty hands and a slow heartbeat was sitting in their most sacred place, touching their dead, being shown the thing that no outsider had ever been shown. The wind moved through the basin. The cubs yipped. The old male raised his head, looked at the cave, and made the greeting rumble, the one between equals, the one that meant "I see you." Cade closed his eyes and let the mountain hold him. Somewhere in the distance, far below, on the lowland plains where the Sethani were already building the research station that would bear his name, A committee was drafting new protocols, and a journalist was writing a story about the human who had changed a planet's relationship with its oldest predator. None of them understood what had actually happened on the mountain. None of them would. What happened was simple, the simplest thing in the universe. Something fierce had recognized something gentle, and something gentle had been brave enough to kneel. 3 years later, the mountain almost lost him. Cade was on his 14th visit, the first one he'd made alone, without the escort, under the revised protocols that the GXBC had approved after 18 months of clean behavioral data when the weather turned. He'd been in the basin for 2 days, running acoustic surveys of the pack's infrasonic communication network, mapping the harmonic patterns that the Thornbacks used to coordinate across the crater rim. The work was painstaking and rewarding. The pack had grown. 3 new cubs had been born in the spring cycle, bringing the total to 12, and the subadult who had watched him from the parallel ridge on his first visit was now a full-grown female, nearly as large as the alpha, with a complete spinal ridge and the calm, territorial confidence of an animal entering its prime. She had taken to following Cade around the basin like a shadow, not guarding, accompanying. She walked beside him when he moved between observation points, lay down near him when he stopped, and occasionally picked up pieces of his equipment in her mouth and carried them to wherever she thought he should be working. He'd named her in his field notes, Ridge, for the distinctive blue-black iridescence of her spinal plates, and she responded to the name with the same ear rotation and chuff that the pack used for their own internal designations. Whether she understood the word or simply recognized the tone and frequency pattern he used when addressing her didn't matter. The effect was the same. She knew when he was talking to her. The storm came from the east, which was unusual. An eastern storm meant a pressure inversion, cold air dropping from the upper atmosphere, colliding with the geothermal warmth of the basin, and the result was violent. Cade had checked the satellite weather feed that morning. The forecast had shown clear skies for 48 hours. The forecast was wrong. He noticed the change at midday. The light flattened. The wind died completely. The air went still and heavy, and the sulfur tang from the geothermal vents intensified as the atmospheric pressure dropped. The pack noticed before he did. The alpha, older now, slower in her movements but no less commanding in her presence, rose from her resting spot and made a vocalization he'd never recorded. A rapid series of short, high-frequency barks, almost staccato, that cut through the basin's ambient sound like an alarm. Every adult responded instantly. Subadults abandoned their patrol routes and converged on the clearing. The nursing mothers gathered their cubs. The old male, Varathsar, slower than ever, his fur now shot through with gray, his damaged ear permanently folded, hauled himself to his feet and moved toward the tree line with a stiffness that spoke of joints worn down by 4 decades of mountain living. Cade recognized the pattern, emergency gathering. The pack was pulling in, concentrating its members, preparing for something. "What's coming?" he said aloud, more to himself than to anyone. Ridge pressed against his side and pushed him toward the tree line. Not gently. She drove her shoulder into his hip with enough force to stagger him, then did it again, herding him the way a sheepdog herds a stray, firm, insistent, not aggressive but absolutely not optional. The storm hit 30 minutes later. It came over the eastern crater rim like a wall, a solid curtain of wind-driven rain and ice that slammed into the basin with a sound like a freight train. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 90 seconds. The wind went from 0 to what Cade estimated at 80 kilometers per hour, ripping through the canopy, tearing branches from the old-growth trees, sending debris scything across the clearing where he'd been sitting minutes before. His acoustic survey equipment, the 3 portable resonance detectors, each one worth more than his annual salary, was torn from its mounting stakes and scattered into the undergrowth. But Cade wasn't in the clearing. He was in the tree line, pressed against the trunk of one of the massive canopy trees, with Ridge on one side and the alpha on the other, their bodies forming a windbreak that shielded him from the worst of the horizontal rain. The rest of the pack was arrayed in the same formation, adults on the outside, cubs in the center, bodies angled to present their armored spinal ridges to the wind. The keratinous plates that Cade had initially cataloged as a defensive adaptation against predators were serving their other function, wind armor. The ridges deflected the driving rain and ice, channeling it over the Thornback's backs and away from the softer fur of their flanks and bellies. Cade was soaked within seconds, despite the shelter. His field jacket was rated for mountain weather, but not for this, not for a pressure inversion storm that turned the air into a horizontal river of ice water. His hands went numb. His legs went numb. He pressed himself against the Alpha's flank and felt her body heat through the soaked fabric of his jacket, warmer than the rain, warmer than the air, the deep metabolic furnace of a 400-kilo endotherm running at full output. The storm lasted 4 hours. Cade spent most of it shaking, not from fear, from cold. Simple, brutal hypothermic cold, the kind that shut down fine motor control and turned rational thought into a narrowing tunnel. He couldn't feel his fingers. He couldn't feel his feet. The shaking was involuntary, his body's last-ditch attempt to generate heat through muscle contraction. And he knew from his survival training that, when the shaking stopped, that meant the hypothermia had progressed past the point where the body could compensate. The pack responded. He didn't understand what was happening at first. The Alpha shifted, pressing harder against his left side. Ridge pressed harder against his right. Then the old male Varathsar, who had been sheltering 3 cubs against the next tree, rose and walked through the driving rain to Cade's position. He lay down directly in front of Cade, his massive body curling into a C-shape that blocked the wind from below. A nursing mother moved in behind, her body closing the gap at Cade's back. They were building a thermal enclosure around him. 4 adult Thornbacks, each one radiating the body heat of a large furnace, forming a living shelter that trapped warmth in the small space where Cade crouched. The temperature inside their circle rose. The shaking slowed. Feeling returned to his hands, painful, tingling, but present. The cubs came next. 3 of them crawled into his lap, pressing their small hot bodies against his chest and stomach. 2 more wedged themselves behind his knees. The smallest one of the spring-born cubs, barely 4 months old, climbed inside his unzipped jacket and pressed against his sternum, its rapid heartbeat drumming against his ribs. Cade wrapped his arms around the cubs in his lap and lowered his head and breathed. The air inside the Thornback enclosure was warm and thick with musk, and every breath he took carried heat into his lungs and from his lungs into his blood and from his blood into his core. The shaking stopped. His thinking cleared. The tunnel opened back up. The storm raged on. Rain hammered the Thornback's spinal ridges and streamed off in rivulets. Wind tore at the canopy above, snapping branches that crashed into the undergrowth 20 meters away. But inside the circle, inside the living wall of fur and bone and metabolic heat, Cade was warm. He was breathing. He was alive because a pack of apex predators had decided, without hesitation, without consultation, without any signal beyond his shaking body and dropping temperature, that their pack member was cold and needed to be warm. When the storm broke, the light came back first, a thin gold line along the western rim where the clouds were tearing apart. Then the wind dropped. Then the rain eased from horizontal to vertical, then to a drizzle, then to nothing. Steam rose from the basin floor as the geothermal warmth reasserted itself, and within 20 minutes the air temperature had climbed back to something survivable. The pack opened. Adults stood, shook off the rain, stretched. The cubs in Cade's lap yawned and scrambled out, immediately distracted by the storm debris scattered across the clearing, new things to investigate, new smells, branches to chew. The smallest cub stayed inside his jacket for another 5 minutes before wriggling free and running after its siblings. Cade stood up. His legs buckled and he caught himself against the Alpha's shoulder. She held his weight without shifting, 250 kilos of stable anchor, and waited until he found his footing. His equipment was destroyed. The resonance detectors were scattered across the basin, 2 of them visibly cracked, the third buried under a fallen branch. His field recorder had survived. It was in his vest pocket, which had stayed dry against the Alpha's flank, but his notebooks were pulp. 6 weeks of behavioral mapping, acoustic analysis charts, territorial boundary sketches, all reduced to wet paper and running ink. None of it mattered. He stood in the steaming basin, soaked, shaking, his jacket reeking of Thornback musk and cub breath, and watched the pack resettle into its post-storm routine. Adults moved to the perimeter to check the territorial markers. Sub-adults trotted out on patrol. The storm might have driven other predators into unusual territory, and the sentry rotation doubled in response. The nursing mothers gathered their cubs for a head count, each one sniffing and chuffing and pressing noses together in the rapid-fire contact ritual that served as the pack's post-emergency roll call. The Alpha counted too. She moved through the clearing with methodical precision, stopping at each adult, each sub-adult, each cub, touching nose to flank, confirming presence. When she reached Cade, she stopped. She sniffed his hands, his face, his jacket. She pressed her nose against his chest where the smallest cub had been, inhaling the mingled scent of human sweat and cub fur and the chemical byproducts of a metabolism that had been shutting down an hour ago and was now, slowly, stabilizing. Then she made the chuff, the greeting, the pack member acknowledgement. Counted, present, accounted for. Cade put his hand on her head and stood in the steaming basin and breathed. The report he filed about the storm incident was 3 pages long. The paragraph that the Sethani media picked up, the one that ran on every news feed on the planet, the one that finally broke through 4 decades of institutional fear, was 1 sentence. They saved my life, not because I asked. Because I was cold and they were warm, and that's what PAC does. The Reclassification Review Board received the report. They read the paragraph, and when the Sethani delegate rose to argue again that the Thornbacks were a lethal threat requiring military containment, the board chair, a territorial xenobiologist named Dreth who had spent her career fighting exactly this kind of institutional inertia, read the paragraph aloud and asked the delegate a single question. How many species on your threat registry would carry a dying stranger inside their body heat for 4 hours? The delegate sat down. The expanded protection order passed unanimously. On the day Cade left Verath Corps for the last time, a temporary departure, 6 months for grant renewal and equipment replacement, and the kind of institutional maintenance that kept field research funded, the Alpha walked him to the boundary marker. She walked slowly. She was older now, her muzzle graying, her gait less fluid, and Cade matched her pace the way he'd always matched it, without comment, without impatience, with the understanding that the pace she set was the pace the mountain moved at, and the mountain had earned the right to move as slowly as it wanted. At the marker he knelt, 1 knee on the shale, hands on his thighs, head lowered. The Alpha pressed her forehead against his chest. She held it there, longer than usual, longer than any greeting or farewell he'd experienced in 3 years of visits. The weight of her skull against his sternum was familiar now, known the way his own heartbeat was known, and underneath it he could feel her pulse, slower than it used to be, the resting heart rate of an animal that had seen more seasons than most of her kind, that had defended this basin and raised these cubs, and maintained this pack through storms and incursions and the slow, relentless press of years. "I'll be back," he said, the same words, always the same words. The Alpha pulled back. She looked at him with those amber eyes, steady, warm, ancient, and made the chuff. Then she turned and walked up the trail, and the cubs followed, and the old male followed, and Ridge followed, pausing once to look back at him with the same backward glance the Alpha had given him on that first day. Follow. Not yet, Cade thought, but soon. He stood up. His knee cracked, it always cracked now, 3 years of kneeling on volcanic rock having taken its toll on the cartilage. He shouldered his pack. He looked at the ridgeline one last time. The mountain was still. The wind carried nothing but cold air and stone scent and the faintest trace of musk. The territorial markers, refreshed that morning, the perimeter holding, the pack safe inside its crater. Cade turned and walked down the mountain. Behind him, carried on the wind from beyond the ridge, the infrasonic pulse came one final time, deep, steady, resonant, a sound that traveled through rock and bone and the small, stubborn chambers of a human heart. The pack counting its members. All present, all accounted for. One of them walking down the mountain with a promise in his chest and a cub's tooth mark on his bootlace, and the certain knowledge that he would come back, because that was what pack did. You came back. Always.